warring gods and titans, or angels and demons. Not only did the intelligence behind the UFO phenomenon create us, and not only does it consequently claim ownership over us, like the worst kind of fathers in traditional societies own their daughters, the conclusion that Charles Fort drew from his research was that all of our dominant religious belief systems and the political power structures that they undergird were also shaped by these manipulative and warlike beings. The Bible is not myth, in the sense of fiction. In Fort's view, it is folklore or the lore of a people, a living memory of events that actually happened to their forefathers and that were eventually chronicled. What the reductively scientific minds of the rationalistic modern age have dismissed as biblical superstition is going to be rehabilitated in the near future. Ford says, when a new science validates the kinds of phenomena that were used by the gods or angels to awe people into submission in ancient or medieval times, these were beings and objects that visited this earth not from a spiritual existence but from outer space. In a veiled reference to Jesus Christ as the fisher of men, Ford says, I think that we're fished for, in the sense of being hooked by someone operating from beyond the surface of the medium that we take to be the upper boundary of our reality. As early as in 1932, in his last book, New Lands, Ford dares to claim that when one puts the type of damned contemporary data which he spent decades sifting through next to the angelic and demonic encounters of antiquity and compares them, it becomes clear that the Bible is full of accounts of space armies. Here is one of his most evocative descriptions of these cosmic conquerors who lord over us. Angels, hordes upon hordes of them. I think that there are, out in interplanetary space, super Tamerlanes at the head of hosts of celestial ravagers. I should say that we are now under cultivation, that we are conscious of it, but have the impertinence to attribute it all to our nobler and higher instincts. Ford, writing in this case in his first book from 1919, is making an excellent point that new agers today still need to take to heart, even those new agers that have come to be respected as serious researchers of close encounters. The various phenomena of close encounters are no more reducible to a psychic projection from our own darkest collective shadow or highest common hopes that the accounts of gods or angels piloting craft in various religious scriptures. That kind of interpretation is a psychological defense mechanism that attributes way too much control, responsibility, and power over the situation than we actually have. That is not to say that there is no psychic dimension to close encounters. On the contrary, as has already been suggested, the phenomenon is full of instances of ESP and psychokinesis. But when we examine religious scriptures, whether the ancient Sanskrit texts or the Bible, we see that these abilities have been used as weapons in warfare between gods and titans or angels and demons. These super Tamerlanes have more often used their minds to set hapless humans on fire than they have deployed nuclear weapons to incinerate entire cities of sinners. We really are victims, slaves, chattel, the colonized, the occupied. That is what so much of the evidence that we have reviewed, from implanted abductees to mutilated corpses, suggests to a mind capable of fearless honesty in its approach to the phenomenon. UFO pilots are not interested in our nuclear weapons because they are afraid that we might come to harm in a nuclear war or that we might destroy Earth's biosphere. As we shall see momentarily in this section, and as we have already seen with regards to Mars, they have repeatedly used nuclear weapons in their own warfare with one another and against civilian populations. Nuclear disarmament is a key message brought to us from contactees and abductees because our nuclear weapons are our only defense against these tyrannical bastards, and they know it. If they want to protect the biosphere, it is because this planet is their property and they eventually plan to resettle its surface with us under the heel of their boots again, as we once were for so many millennia. Our thousands of thorough nuclear weapons, even were they simply to be detonated in situ, are an insurance policy that the Promethean ethos of give me liberty or give me death will prevail before we are subjected to another epoch of manipulation and enforced servility at the hands of that shining stupidity that calls himself the Almighty God. Hear it from Charles Ford in the last book he wrote before his untimely death. That a new prophet had appeared upon the moon and had excited new hope of evoking response from the bland and shining stupidity that has so often been mistaken for God, or from the appalling that is so identified with divinity, from the clutched and menacing fist that has so often been worshipped. The use of the term shining here in connection to the stupidity of God is significant. As has already been noted, Elohim is the Hebrew name for the gods, of which Yahweh, the father of Jesus, is the Lord or chief of the gods, or Adonai Elohim. The word Elohim comes from the root Elu, meaning the shining. Ford knows exactly what he is saying. If people could actually spend some serious time in the heaven of the Bible, rather than just be offered tantalizing and bewitching glimpses of it, as those subject to close encounters have been, it would make atheists out of them, and they would burn their Bibles. Ford's penultimate book, in which he makes the claim, namely Lo, 1931, was originally going to be titled God is an Idiot. A sadistic idiot with awesome power, the wielding of said power sometimes leaves Ford with the impression that the Lord of the celestial host is nothing less than the focal point of cosmic evil, as in this passage from 1919, in which he is describing what we now call huge black triangular UFOs. Vast dark thing with wings of a super bat or jet black super construction, most likely one of the spores of the evil one, hovers on wings or wing-like appendages or planes that are hundreds of miles from tip to tip. A super evil thing that is exploiting us. By evil, I mean that which makes us useful. He obscures a star. He shoves a comet. I think he is a vast black brooding vampire. Of course, this flies in the face of the naive morality of those New Agers who want so desperately to believe that with greater power comes greater ethical responsibility. Nothing in the data of close encounters suggests anything like that is true. In cases where there are seemingly benevolent messages and sagacious counsel, a deeper look will unveil psyops machinations by messengers of deception. The glitter and fairy dust of these revelations only reflects the light of the shining stupidity. Why would we ever expect it to be otherwise? In our own mainstream history of human civilizations, the most technically advanced and militarily powerful cultures have been the most ruthless colonizers, enslavers, and exploiters of those who are less evil than them. Moreover, the best colonizers do this by dividing the population they conquer, pitting them against themselves with various manufactured belief systems, all of which are false. What Ford found is what we should expect to find. It is where the data leads. Once humanity builds itself back up again after the flood, what seems to be a cosmopolitan civilization, an urban culture with a single world language, undertakes a project to build something like a tower by means of which they will be able to ascend to the heavens. The Lord is once again afraid and jealous of their progress and decides to destroy this unified human civilization, scatter its survivors, and set them against each other. Here are the passages on the Tower of Babel from Genesis 11, 1-9. Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words, and they said, "Come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the sky to make a name for ourselves, else we shall be scattered all over the world." The Lord came down to look at the city and tower that man had built, and the Lord said, "If, as one people with one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. Let us then go down and confound their speech there, so that they shall not understand one another's speech." Thus the Lord scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confounded the speech of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Babel or Babylon was the site of the great ziggurat or multi-tiered step pyramid that was intended to be a stairway to heaven. Bab means gateway or portal in Semitic languages, and El, as we have seen, means shining one or God. So that Babylon might be the place of the shining portal or the gateway to godhood. Clearly a door that the Lord does not want man to walk through. Babylon lies at the heart of Mesopotamia, and it is from this land that the next two figures central to the account of Genesis emerge.
we are told that both Abraham and his nephew, Lot, are from Ur of the Chaldeans, Genesis 11:28. The Chaldeans of Ur were Mesopotamians, dwelling in nearby Babylon, in what is now Iraq. Frequent reference is also made to Elam and its king. Chedorlaomer, who leads a confederation of chieftains in a great battle during Abraham's lifetime, Genesis 14, the Elamite kingdom was the oldest civilization of the present-day Iran, a land that would soon be dominated by the Persians. Mention is made of the Hittites as well, another Aryan tribe who were ancestors of the Iranian Medes. At one point later on, the Hittites even referred to Abraham as the elect of the Lord among them. Genesis 23, 3-6. In the opening of Genesis 24, we are also told that Abraham demands his servants send for a wife from his native land, namely Ur, for his son Isaac. So the line of Abraham, including Ishmael, whom Abraham fathers by his wife's servant Hagar, issues forth from the area between Iraq and Iran, a cradle of civilization and the core of what would centuries later become the Islamic world. This is significant because the Lord not only promises to make the descendants of Abraham, whose wife is thought to be sterile, into a nation as multitudinous as the stars, but the angels who meets Hagar in the desert promises to do the same for Ishmael, who marries an Egyptian woman, a wild ass of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He shall dwell alongside of all his kinsmen. Genesis 16:11. At no point in the course of human history have the Jews constituted a significant percentage of the earth's population. But if we take the Muslims to be the great nation that Lord promises to make of the descendants of Ishmael, Genesis 21:13-18, then the prophecy concerning the descendants of Abraham appears to be one that was fulfilled. Three major pagan civilizations in this part of the world would have to be destroyed by those in the line of Abraham for this to come to pass: Babylonia, Egypt, and Persia. Note that Egypt also features in the origin story of Abraham, who takes refuge there from a famine in Canaan for a while, during the course of which he gets wealthy, apparently with the Lord's blessing, by whoring his wife to the Pharaoh. Genesis 12:14-20. After leaving Mesopotamia for Canaan, the land that would become Israel, Abraham and his nephew Lot agreed to spread out. Genesis 13. Lot settles in Sodom, which was on the plain of Jordan, together with its twin city of Gomorrah. Both men have encounters with the Lord that further illuminate the very finite humanoid character of the Abrahamic God who sends Jesus as a Messiah. One evening, the Lord visits Abraham to promise him the land of Canaan and multitude of descendants, who would eventually prosper despite a prophesied period of 4 centuries of slavery in Egypt. This encounter elapses from the hours just before sunset in the twilight and the early nighttime. God, appears in the guise of a real estate agent, so that when Abraham asks how he knows that he has closed his contract with his God, the Lord replies that he should provide him with an animal sacrifice. Genesis 15. The acceptance of this sacrifice, which Abraham does not allow birds of prey to devour, is the first of many instances in the Bible where we are given a strange account of a machine that the chroniclers of the tradition seem somewhat at a loss to accurately describe within their cultural context.
When the sun set and it was very dark, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between those pieces.
Genesis 15:17. Also take note of the fact that the Lord demands Abraham, his kinfolk, and all of his slaves be marked in their flesh, like cattle, as a sign that they now belong to him. Anyone who refuses to be branded in this way will be totally ostracized from his family and the community at large. Making this mark, namely circumcision, not only on Abraham's family but also on his slaves, is apparently more important to the Lord than asking Abraham to free his slaves. Genesis 17. This is tantamount to evidence of the Lord's approval of the institution of slavery. The next visitation of the Lord is even stranger. If we have been falsely conditioned to abstractly thinking of the Abrahamic God as an all-knowing and all-powerful creator of the cosmos, 3 men appear outside Abraham's tent and the Lord is clearly one of them.
The Lord appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre. He was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Looking up, he saw 3 men standing near him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, and bowing to the ground, he said, "My lords, If it please you, do not go past your servant.
Genesis 18, 1-5. As Abraham and his wife Sarah hurry to cater to this guest, one of them tells Sarah that despite being an old and withered woman far past menopause, when he returns in the following year, she will have had a child by her 100-year-old husband. While she conceals any outward expression of how ridiculous she finds this, the man is able to read her mind and confronts her for faithless skepticism with the rebuke, "Is anything too wondrous for the Lord?" Genesis 18, 9-15. The three men then take Abraham up to a hill from which they can overlook the plain of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham's nephew Lot has settled. Since he has now been chosen as an insider, the Lord decides to reveal to him the divine plan for the imminent destruction of these cities, whose inhabitants are supposed to have become so sinful that the outcry against them has reached the Lord. The transition from the scene where the three men are with Abraham to the next one wherein the two Elohim, the angels are literally messengers of God, into the town of Sodom to retrieve Lot is key. The text of Genesis 18-19 reads,
The three men set out from there and looked down towards Sodom, Abraham walking with them to see them off. The men went on from there to Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. The two angels arrived in Sodom in the evening, as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom.
In other words, the Lord is definitely one of the three men who visit Abraham and Sarah at their encampment. While he remains behind with Abraham, he sends his two lieutenants into Sodom to evacuate Abraham's nephew and his family before he subjects Sodom and Gomorrah to an aerial attack. The details in the description of this fiery assault from the sky witnessed by Abraham as Lot and his family head for the hills are noteworthy.
As dawn broke, the angels urged Lot on, saying, Up, take your wife and your two remaining daughters, lest you be swept away because of the iniquity of the city.
Still, he delayed.
So the men seized his hand and hands of his wife and two daughters, in the Lord's mercy on him, and brought him out and left him outside the city. When they had brought them outside, one said, Flee for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, lest you be swept away. But Lot said to them, Oh no, my Lord, you have been so gracious to your servant, and have already shown me so much kindness in order to save my life. But I cannot flee to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Look, that town there is near enough to flee to. It is such a little place. Let me flee there. It is such a little place, and let my life be saved. And he replied, Very well, I will grant you this favor too, and I will not annihilate the town of which you have spoken. Hurry, flee to there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Hence the town came to be called Zoar, the little place. As the sun rose upon the earth, and Lot entered Zoar, the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah sulphurous fire from the Lord out of heaven. He annihilated those cities and the entire plain, and all the inhabitants of the city and the vegetations of the ground. Lot's wife looked back, and she thereupon turned into a pillar of salt. Next morning, Abraham hurried to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and all the land of the plain. He saw the smoke of the land rising like the smoke of a kiln. Thus it was that, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, and annihilated the cities where Lot dwelt, God was mindful of Abraham, and removed Lot from the midst of the upheaval. Lot went up from Zoar, and settled in the hill country with his two daughters, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar, and he and his two daughters lived in a cave.
Genesis 19, 15-30. This cannot but evoke, in the mind of a modern reader, the image of a mushroom cloud and the poisonous radioactive fallout following a nuclear strike. Although one of the gods promises Lot that the little town nearby Sodom and Gomorrah will be spared, he is still afraid to dwell there on account of its proximity to the recently destroyed cities. What natural catastrophe could prompt such a fear after he had destroyed the two cities? While Lot and his daughters make it to a cave where they are safe from the proverbial fallout in the days after the strike, Lot's wife, who turned back, undergoes a strange transformation that the chronicler grasps at the metaphor in order to express. Perhaps it is a deadly metamorphosis akin to that suffered by victims of atomic mutation. Just as the three men eat and drink the meal prepared by Sarah, the two of them that continue on to Sodom also eat a feast and have their dirty feet washed. They are carnal enough to be lusted after by the men of Sodom, although they have this seemingly magical power to blind this mob with a flash of light once the mob attempts to storm Lot's house. Genesis 19-11. Interestingly, Lot's sons-in-law find the warnings from the men ridiculous and think that Lot is joking when he asks them to live with him before the city is destroyed by the Lord. Genesis 19:12-14. This means that despite their telepathic and psychokinetic abilities, there was nothing so evidently divine, about these men that they would be believed without question. The Elohim, who acts as angels, are messengers of the Lord in the Old Testament, for the most part do not have wings. This is a much later artistic convention. Finally, as in the case of the place of the slaves in the covenant of Abraham, we have to ask about the ethics of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Before two of the three men arrive at Sodom, Abraham negotiates with their leader who stays behind, namely the Lord, over how many righteous people would have to be in this supposedly wicked city in order for the Lord to spare it for their sake. Abraham gets the Lord to keep lowering the number. Genesis 18:22-32. However, in the end we know that only Lot and his family are forcibly evacuated by the Lord's two agents, and at that not his whole family, but only his daughters. His sons stay behind and his wife turns back. This means that the Lord considers Lot the only righteous man in Sodom. But how virtuous is a man who offers up his two virgin daughters to be raped by a mob of lecherous men gathered around his house? Genesis 19:6-8. After the destruction of Sodom, the same man has sex with these two daughters. We are told that they get him so drunk that on 2 nights in a row, Lot does not realize that he is having sex with first his older daughter and then his younger one. Genesis 19:31-35. Now this is an old man. If he were that drunk, he would not have been able to go through with the act so that he fathered children by both of these girls. Is it then not much more likely that Lot is spared because he is the nephew of Abraham, rather than on account of his own virtue? This, however, only begs the question of Abraham's own virtue or lack thereof. No episode in the narrative of Genesis is more relevant to this question than the famous or infamous offering up Isaac as a sacrificial animal. The story is told in Genesis 22, which begins with these lines: "Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, 'Abraham,' and he answered, 'Here I am.' And he said, 'Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you.'" Once Abraham arrives at Mount Moriah and begins to ascend with the firestone and knife, having left his servants behind with their mules, Isaac, who is carrying the logs on which, unbeknown to himself, his father plans to sacrifice him, the boy hauntingly asks, "Father, here are the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son." Genesis 22:7-8. The narrative reaches its culmination when Abraham's evident willingness to murder his son on the command of the Lord and the Lord's approval of this sign of Abraham's absolute obedience as expressed through one of his angels. They arrived at the place of which God had told him. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar, on top of the wood, and Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. Then an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham," and he answered, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not raise your hand against the boy, or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. Because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your favored one, I will bestow my blessings upon you, and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and sands on the seashore. And your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants, because you have obeyed my command." Genesis 22:9-12, 15-18. All of this is as much as to say that the conquest of the world by the Abrahamic peoples, the Judeo-Christians and the Muslims, with the support of a Lord who appears now for the first time of many times to come as a heavenly or celestial warlord, is founded on the willingness of Abraham to unquestioningly slaughter his own son as if he were a sacrificial animal in obedience to a voice from the sky. In Moses' first encounter with Elohim, he is spoken to from amidst a luminous object that settled within a thicket, an object whose light is so striking that Moses is astonished that it does not burn the thicket as would a fire, which is the only thing within his sphere of knowledge that is capable of producing such a light. Exodus 3:2. As we have seen, the Elohim of the Old Testament are simply visiting strangers who have unusual abilities, like being able to render fertile an old woman such as Abraham's wife Sarah. Genesis 18:1-2 set Jacob's hip bone out of joint simply by touching it. Genesis 32:24-25, or strike down the Sodomite mob amassed at Lot's house by projecting a blinding flash of light sometime shortly before the twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are subjected to aerial nuclear bombardment by Elohim. Genesis 19. It is with a contest in the use of such unusual abilities that the foundational narrative of the religion of Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad begins. Moses and his associate Aaron are in Pharaoh's court, demanding freedom for their people, and a battle in the display of psychic abilities ensues between them and the Pharaoh's practitioners of alchemy, or the art or craft from Chemith, Chemith being the indigenous name of ancient Egypt. They both throw down the rods and magic wands and have them turned into serpents. Exodus 7:8-13. It becomes clear that both sides are adept at wielding the serpent power on the gods, and so the Lord eventually resorts to plagues and the overnight slaughter of innocent Egyptian newborns in order to intimidate Pharaoh to free the Jews. When the Lord hears the cry of his people, the Israelites, and decides the time has come to free them from slavery in Egypt, he himself hardens Pharaoh's heart on the gods and that of his courtiers into the unbelievably obstinate stubbornness we see as Pharaoh fails to take a lesson from the plagues administered and cleansed through Moses. The Hebrew Lord claims to have done this in order that it might provide an excuse to show his signs and to mock and strike fear into the hearts of the Egyptians. Exodus 10:1-2. We then hear that even though most of the common Egyptian people take kindly to Moses and the Israelites, the Lord punishes them terribly for the divinely predetermined recalcitrance of Pharaoh and his royal court. Their innocent firstborn child are mercilessly slaughtered as Egyptian mothers and fathers are left crying out in terror like never before into the darkness of the desert night. Exodus 11:3-7. Apparently familiar with the malevolent use of psychic ability and regretful having been intimidated by such parlor tricks, Pharaoh repents of this decision to free the Jewish servants and sends his army into the Sinai desert in pursuit of them on their way to the promised land. Throughout their years-long exodus in the Sinai, the Israelites are led by a purposefully guided aerial object that appears as a pillar, amud, column of cloud by day and as a pillar of fire by night. The column is low flying enough for them to observe its cylindrical structure, which has a steel grey cloud-like hue during the day and glows with a fiery light after sunset. Reaching back to Paul Hill's scientific analysis of UFOs, we can rather confidently identify this cloud-like aura surrounding the pillar and other UFOs described in the Bible as the ionization effect produced by the electromagnetic propulsion system. We are told that the Lord, in all his glory, is inside, aboard the pillar of fire and the cloud. Exodus 16:10-14-24. The tent of the meeting, the center point of the Israelites' pitched camp during the Exodus, is set up and removed, based on where the cylindrical object comes to a halt and hovers at a stationary point. Exodus 40:33-38, or where it occasionally even touches down. Numbers 9:17. There is one particular night when the object does not emit its usual fiery glow. The Egyptian army has come up the rear of the Israelites, who are effectively cornered at the Red Sea. With no place to run unless they can cross it somehow, the cloud, then takes a position between the Egyptian and the Israelites and remains there throughout the night, as if to block the Egyptians from attacking the Israelites, and by effectively turning off its light, it prevents the Egyptians from even seeing the Israelite camp as they might have had the object been hovering above them in its usually luminous nocturnal mode that allowed the Israelites to march at night. Exodus 14:19, 20, 13-21. The following morning, the Israelites awake to see the object hovering over the Red Sea, and directly beneath it is a channel cut into the sea with the water neatly piled up into walls on either side. Exodus 14:24, 14:22, 15:8. Even more surprisingly, when the Israelites cross the channel, probably expecting to be wading knee-deep in the mud, they find that the seabed is dry and firm underfoot. Exodus 14:22. Once the Egyptian army enters the channel in pursuit of the Israelites, Moses is told, telepathically, by the Lord to raise his hand over the sea, as if he were about to command it by his own magical powers, whereupon two very striking events take place. First, the Egyptians appear as if they are suddenly struggling greatly. Their horses look as if they require the strain of a gallop just to move at all, and their chariots are crushed as if under an invisible weight that rips their wheels off. Exodus 14:24-25. Then the walls of the water on either side of the Egyptians gives way, collapsing the channel through the Red Sea, but only in the area behind the Israelites who are still advancing through the artificial channel. Exodus 14:26-29. All of the phenomenological descriptions of the channel are consistent with the projection of some kind of anti-gravitational beam from out of the cylindrical object hovering the sea. Such a beam might have pressed down so hard on the seabed after having cleared the water aside into walls that it compressed all the moisture out of the mud into a dry crossing path. The beam could have been phased out at its center to allow the Israelites to cross, and then filled again to cross the Egyptians by artificially increasing their weight, before the beam was removed altogether in that portion of the channel so as to drown Pharaoh's army. Our narrative culminates, and its socio-political significance becomes clear. Once the Israelites arrive at Mount Sinai, the cylindrical object comes down upon the mountain in an illuminated state, causing great tremors and raising up smoke or dust. Exodus 19:16-18. This cannot be a description of volcanic activity because the pillar comes down and sits at the top of the mountain, which would have been blown open by a volcanic eruption. Exodus 19:20. The Israelites were warned in advance not to come too close to the mountain when the cloud lands on it. Exodus 19:12, 21, 24. And Moses, although apparently shielded in some way from the said danger, would return to the people with a peculiar glow about him after prolonged proximal exposure. Exodus 34, 29-35. Finally, Moses actually enters the cloud. Exodus 25, 15-18, and comes out having received stone tablets that the Lord has engraved with commandments. Exodus 24:12, that are to ground not only the political state of the Jews, but the entire Abrahamic tradition of revealed religion, Jesus included. Of course, Moses broke the first set of tablets in a rage upon finding that his people had reverted to boisterous pagan rites during his long stay inside the object on the mountain. After pleading with the Lord not to destroy the entire Israelite camp as a punishment, and in order to assuage the Lord's anger with a lesser punishment, Moses rounds up his faithful men and has them massacre hundreds of their own brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, and children, all for some singing and dancing around the idol of a golden calf. Exodus 32. In evident approval of the massacre, the Lord then descends again in the cloud to meet with Moses and engrave a second set of tablets. Exodus 34:5. Specific orders are also given for the construction and style of furnishing for a tabernacle to house the stone tablets engraved with the law, and once constructed, the tent of the meeting would be filled with light from the pillar at night, and the Elohim would even come down into the structure to receive sacrifices and give commands in person, face to face or mouth to mouth. Exodus 40:34-38, Numbers 11:25, Numbers 12:4-8. At one point, angered with the Israelites, the Lord strikes out from the tabernacle and sets fire to the parts of the Israelite camp. Numbers 11:1. What was on the tablet inscribed by the Lord on Mount Sinai? While it is commonly thought that the tablet featured 10 commandments, the text of Exodus, especially taken together with Leviticus and Deuteronomy, clearly states that the 10 widely known commandments, set apart by subsequent tradition as the Decalogue, were only that first 10 of much more extensive set of commandments constituting an entire system of divinely revealed law and order. Let us begin with the broadest of these fundamental principles, one that encompasses the others: justice. To the Lord of Moses, justice is synonymous with the commensurate recompense delivered to a person that has wronged another in the community. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Exodus 21:23-35. It would appear that we are presented with a cold but rigorously logical system whereby each person is held accountable for the precise measure of his or her own transgression against others. However, in the opening lines of the Lord's greatest decree to Israel, in fire and smoke upon Mount Sinai, we learn that those who violate the laws of the Lord thereby place a curse upon their blood descendants, which endures for centuries, while the grandchildren of the righteous ones are graciously rewarded for no good deeds of their own. I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned or jealous God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and fourth generations of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Exodus 20:5-6. Thus, in the Torah's conception of justice, one is not judged on the basis of one's own conscience, but on the basis of the community's obedience to the Lord. We see the code of supposedly commensurate justice established in the Torah at work more specifically in the regulations defining property rights. In the forbidding of a person to covet or steal another's house, wife, slaves, beasts of burden, or goods, we have an implicit declaration that each person has an exclusive right to private property. Exodus 22:1-4. This means that things can be inscribed with a person's ownership, and a person defined by the things that he owns. Only the latter can explain the sanction of killing a thief caught in the act by the owner of the property he was attempting to steal. Exodus 21:1-4. For the only other sanctioning of killing is a recompense for having murdered a person. Thus, for a Hebrew to violate a man's property was to profoundly violate his sense of self. If a thief is not caught in the act, he is to pay back double what he stole, or if he cannot afford to do so, he will be sold into slavery. Exodus 22:1-4. Indeed, the right to property includes ownership of people as well as objects, and the right to treat them brutally as property. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and he dies there and then, he must be avenged. But if he survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, since he is the other's property. Exodus 21:20. While it is disturbingly odd today to think of women's rights as part of the question of private property, it is so defined within the Torah. For Moses and his Lord, women, one half of the human race, were in the last analysis the most prized property of their fathers, husbands, and masters. We see that a man wears his woman like adorning garments when the Lord commands that no man shall marry his father's former wife so as to remove his father's garment. Deuteronomy 23:1. In the very code given by Lord on Mount Sinai, we hear him sanction the selling of woman. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not ever be freed as male slaves are. Exodus 21:7. In this form of economic exchange, women who have lost their virginity are not only considered damaged goods, they are publicly shamed and then stoned to death for having spoiled their father's property and challenged his authority over use of their sexuality. Deuteronomy 22:13, 20-21. If the man who seduced the woman is known, this fate can be avoided if he pays her bride price to her father, whether or not the father actually gives her to him to take home. Exodus 21:15-16. Women who are engaged and then raped and are too afraid to cry out for help are condemned to death. In this case, the rapist is also condemned to death, but only because he stole another man's property. Deuteronomy 22:23. Most shockingly, if a woman is raped in a deserted place and tries to cry out, but there is no one to hear her, she is not killed, but the rapist must pay the girl's father 50 shekels of silver on the goods and is forced to marry her and forbidden from ever divorcing her. Deuteronomy 22:28-29. The Lord of Israel apparently gives no thought to how she might feel about being forced to live under the authority of a rapist and sleep in his bed every night for the rest of her life. Of course, while woman's sexuality is the property of one man, men are entitled to take many wives to entertain themselves, so long as they are wealthy enough not to diminish the food, clothing, and conjugal rights of those that they already possess. Exodus 21:10-11. One might note in the passage above that women are provided for by men, and some might make an argument that their duties towards men are justified on this basis. However, it is only because a woman is forbidden from participating in the public sector that a man must provide for her. not necessarily because she does not want to work to meet her own needs. This ban of women from public and religious offices, often indistinguishable in the temple state, is on the account of the severe impurity the Lord thought her to incur during her monthly period. Not only is it forbidden to touch a menstruating woman, but anything that she touches, sits on, or otherwise comes into contact with is contaminated by her. If these objects are touched by someone else, that person contracts the impurity and can in turn pass it on to others, until the contaminated person bathes and washes thoroughly and then waits for the sun to set. Leviticus 15:19-17. We might note that a woman is also considered unclean after giving birth, and that the period of both severe and minor contamination for giving birth to a girl, 2 weeks and 66 days, is double that for a boy, 7 days and 33 days. Leviticus 12:1-5. Perhaps it is in part due to this kind of impurity that women are outsiders in the relationship between man and his Lord. The Lord of Israel only speaks to women concerning their husbands and sons, and very rarely at that. When Moses first hears the Lord, he is told, "Thus shall you speak to the Israelites. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you." Exodus 3:15. Covenant makers are always only men. In fact, a woman with spiritual power, sorcery, the like of which Moses practices, is to be killed. "You shall not tolerate a sorceress." Exodus 22:17. One of the so-called 10 commandments that stand at the heart of the Torah is, "Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord giveth thee." Exodus 20:12. We also learn at Mount Sinai that it is a commandment whose violation is punishable by death. "He who insults his father or his mother shall be put to death." Exodus 21:17. Later on in Deuteronomy 18-21, the subject is broached in more vivid detail, and we learn that the specific circumstances of the death sentence for disobedience to one's parents are that the person is brought into the public square before the town leaders to be shamed and then stoned to death by the men of the community. After the rite of circumcision, which symbolizes the Lord's covenant with Abraham, the most important aspect of worship defined by Torah is arguably the observance of the Sabbath. It commensurates the completion of the Lord's cosmic creation. Exodus 20:8-11. It is to be a day, of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Exodus 31:12-15. The Sabbath also symbolizes the Lord's consecration of Israel, and it is clear throughout the Torah that this God may have created heaven and earth, but He is the Lord of the Hebrews. They are His, treasured possession among all the peoples. Exodus 19:5. Aside from circumcision and the Sabbath, dietary laws and this governing ritual purity play a huge role in Judaism. Virtually the entire book of Leviticus in the Torah concerns itself with them. Animals such as camels, demons, hares, swine, sea creatures that are not fish, and some types of birds are unclean and forbidden to eat or even to touch. Leviticus 11:2-19. The Lord defines Israel as a kingdom of priests. Exodus 19:6. In other words, as a temple state, the heart of Israel is the tent of meeting, or later, the Holy of Holies, a most sacred space where the Ark of the Covenant is housed. This is the official place where the Lord descends to meet with the priesthood and thereby speak to Israel. Exodus 29:42. The Lord ordains the line of Aaron as the priests who guard the Lord's tabernacle, and He even decrees how their robes and adornments are to be made. Exodus 28:1-5. The priest's clothing is to include linen breeches, to cover their nakedness, which, if it were at all revealed in the tent of meeting, would mean a vengeful death sentence from the Lord. These regulations regarding the ordination of priesthood are to be eternally inviolable. Exodus 28:42-43. The chief task of the priests is to administer many kinds of bloody sacrifices that the Lord demands. One standard sacrifice, which is to be carried out throughout the generations, is of 2 lambs a day, one in the morning and one in the evening. Precise mixtures of spices and wine are offered up into the fire together with the lambs, so that the order of the offering would be pleasing to the Lord. Exodus 29:38-41. There are even traces within the Torah of a tradition that may later have been purged from the text. that of human sacrifice of firstborn children to the Lord. Exodus 22, 28-29. Moses was not the only one of the Israelites who was permitted to be inside the tabernacle while the Elohim were visiting it. Joshua was also allowed to do so as a young man. Exodus 33:11. So it is unsurprising that after the death of Moses, the Lord appoints him the next leader of the Israelites. Joshua 1-5. The general who will conquer the land that Moses merely promised them. Success in this conquest is contingent on strict obedience to the law that was revealed to Moses. Joshua 1-6-8. The Lord commands Joshua to leave the livestock and other possessions of the Israelites, including the women, on the near side of the Jordan River and to send an army of fighting men across it to conquer the land. Joshua 1-14. When Joshua conveys this directive to his men, they swear to obey his command just as they obeyed those of Moses, so long as he is strong and resolute, and they would also threaten to put to death anyone who disobeys the orders of Joshua, and that would include anyone who might consciously dissent with respect to the plan to invade and conquer Canaan. Joshua 1:16-18. The seizure of the fortified city of Jericho is to be the beachhead of the Israelite invasion of Canaan, and it begins when two spies enter the city on a reconnaissance mission. These find refuge in the house of a harlot named Rahab, who relates to them how the entire population is already intimidated by the Israelites on account of having heard of the miracles performed by the Lord on their behalf, such as the parting of the Red Sea. Joshua 2:9-11. In exchange for her collaboration, including her misdirection of a search party trying to capture the spies promise Rahab that her family will be spared by the invading Israelites as long as they do not step outside of her house, which is to be marked with a crimson cord. Joshua 3:13-19. Later we learn that only Rahab and her household are spared in the destruction of Jericho. Joshua 1:17, 22, 24-25. On the way towards Jericho, the Israelites are told to march a fixed distance between the Ark of the Covenant, which is being carried by priests wearing special garments, and the Ark apparently acts as a pathfinder or guidance system to help Israelites march along a route that they have never traveled before. Joshua 3:1-4. As they encamped along the Jordan River, Joshua tells his people to purify themselves since the Lord is about to once again perform wonders in the midst. Joshua 3:5. The first of these wonders concerns the manner in which the Israelites are to cross the Jordan River into the territory that Lord has promised to them and intends to help them conquer. Here is what Joshua relates to his people concerning this impending act of God.
Come closer and listen to the words of the Lord your God. You shall know that a living God is among you, and that he will dispossess for you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. The Ark of the Covenant of the Sovereign of all the earth is advancing before you into Jordan. Now select 12 men from the tribe of Israel, 1 man from each tribe. When the feet of the priests bearing the Ark of the Lord, the Sovereign of all the earth, come to rest in the waters of the Jordan, the water coming from upstream will be cut off and will stand in a single heap.
Joshua 3:9-13. The text of this chapter goes on to explain the distinctly paranormal, not to say supernatural character of this event.
Now the Jordan keeps flowing over its entire bed throughout the harvest season. But as soon as the bearers of the ark reached the Jordan, and the feet of priests bearing their ark dipped into the water at its edge, the water coming down from upstream piled up in a single heap a great way off, at Adam, the town next to Zarethan, and those flowing away downstream to the Sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, ran out completely. So the people crossed Jericho. The priests who bore the ark of the Lord's covenant stood on dry land exactly in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed over the dry land until the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan. As soon as the priests who bore the ark of the Lord's covenant came up out of the Jordan, and the feet of the priests stepped onto the dry land, the waters of the Jordan resumed their course, flowing over its entire bed as before. Joshua 3:15-16, 4:18. In other words, Joshua's crossing of the Jordan River is described in similar terms as the parting of the Red Sea by the cloud, except that since it is a flowing river rather than a sea, the water is dammed out into an invisible wall only on one side of the Israelites.
The Lord tells Joshua to demand that the Israelites commemorate this wonder by setting up a monument of 12 stones in the drained out riverbed of the Jordan, one for each of the Israel's 12 tribes. Joshua 4, 1-9. These stones, which are supposed to have been there underwater to the day this narrative was put into writing, constitute a sacred site or consecrated place. Ask yourself what, then, it is that makes a place consecrated to the sovereign of all the earth, who rides around in a UFO. Or listen to the prophet Joshua when he explains that, "In time to come, when your children ask their fathers, 'What is the meaning of those stones?' tell your children, 'Here the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry land. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you crossed, just as your Lord did to the sea of the reeds, which he dried up before us until we crossed. Thus all the peoples of the earth shall know how mighty is the hand of the Lord, and you shall fear the Lord your God always." Joshua 4:21-24. As 40,000 shock troops crossed the Jordan at the insistence of the Lord to the steps of Jericho for battle, we are told that on that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, so that they revered him all his days as they had revered Moses. Joshua 4:13-14. This establishes that the same Lord guiding Moses is now acting as the supreme commander of Joshua's troops as they begin the conquest of Canaan, the land that is to become Israel, with the sacking of Jericho. If there were any remaining doubt as to the fact that the plunder, rape, and wholesale slaughter of an entire civilian population that we are about to witness is taking place under the order of the UFO Lord of the Elohim, the Father of Jesus, the next episode in the book of Joshua makes this crystal clear. On the far side of the river crossing, a man claiming to be the captain of the Lord's army, the word host military, means Joshua in order to brief him on coordinating with the Lord for the military task ahead. Joshua 5:13-14. The very human-like appearance of this God is clear from the fact that at first Joshua thinks that he might be an enemy soldier. Joshua 5:13. Once it becomes clear who this is, Joshua prostrates himself face down on the ground in front of the God who is standing there with his sword drawn and asks, "What does my Lord command his servant?" And the captain of the Lord's army, asks Joshua to remove his sandals in respect because, on account of his very presence, the ground on which they are standing is holy ground. Joshua 5:14-15. All of this amounts to a deputizing of Joshua and a divine mandate for his mission. The Lord's intervention here, however, continues in an ever more direct fashion. He gives specific instructions to Joshua, again involving use of the ark, to bring down the legendary fortifications of Jericho so that the Israelites can storm the city. This is the second of the promised wonders on the course. The Lord's ark has already been used as a navigational instrument and as the source of a force capable of repelling water. Now it is used as a sonic weapon. It interacts with vibrations of sound, possibly amplifying and concentrating the sonic waves before directing them at the walls of Jericho. The Lord gives specific instructions for how this is to be accomplished. "Let all your troops march around the city and complete one circuit of the city. Do this 6 days, with 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns preceding the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the horns. And when a long blast is sounded on the horn, as soon as you hear that sound of the horn, all the people shall give a mighty shout. Thereupon the city wall will collapse, and the people shall advance, every man straight ahead." Joshua 6:2-5. The Israelites follow these instructions, and after marching around the city the designated number of times with the Ark of the Covenant carried at the head, the army of Israel, who have been ordered to remain silent until the last circuit on the last day, shout out at once on the order of Joshua. When the ram's horns are sounded and the walls of Jericho suddenly come crumbling down. Joshua 6:20. This allows for the army of Israel to rush in and capture the city. Here is what we are told about the conduct of the men under Joshua's command, and thus ultimately under the command of the Lord of the Elohim. "They exterminated everything in the city with the sword, man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and ass. They burned down the city and everything in it. But the silver and the gold and the objects of copper and iron were deposited in the treasury of the house of the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot and her father's family were spared by Joshua, for she had hidden the messengers that Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. The Lord was with Joshua,
and his fame spread throughout the land.
Joshua 6:21-27. So every civilian, including innocent children, were slaughtered in a lightning war directed by the Lord from his UFO and accomplished with his wondrous instrument, the ark. The only persons judged worthy of survival are the family of a prostitute who treasonably collaborated in the slaughter of her fellow citizens, including the women and children in her city. We are told that the conquest of the rest of Canaan by the Israelites, who turned Canaan into the island of Israel by decimating its native population, proceeds in a comparably merciless manner. One more particularly noteworthy episode in the course of this conquest takes place when the king of Jerusalem, this is Jerusalem before it becomes an Israelite city, assembles an alliance of 5 kings, himself included, to meet Joshua's army and halt their advance. In the face of this massive alliance, Joshua remains undismayed.
Joshua addressed the Lord. He said in the presence of the Israelites, "Stand still, O sun at Gibeon, O moon in the valley of Ajalon." And the sun stood still, and the moon halted, while a nation wreaked judgment on its foes. Thus the sun halted in mid-heaven, and did not press on to set, for a whole day, for the Lord fought for Israel. Neither before nor since has there ever been such a day, when the Lord acted on words spoken by a man.
Joshua 10:12-14. Obviously, the sun did not stand still in the sky. What is being described here is the light being projected from a UFO onto the surface of the earth, a light which is, as many modern close encounter experiences have described, brighter than the sun, illuminating every detail of the surface of the earth, even in the middle of the night. A light this bright would have made the actual sun impossible to see, thereby leaving Joshua and his men with the impression that the sun had been made to stand still. Once Joshua and his men capture the 5 kings allied against them, he has his officers place their feet on the king's neck as a sign of victory, and then he impales the 5 kings on stakes throughout the evening before throwing their corpses in a cave. Joshua 10:24-27. Not all of the prophetic figures in the Bible are as unquestionably obedient as Joshua. In the books of Ezekiel and Job, we see, in the first case, a prophet, and in the second case, his close companions, questioning the Lord's conception of justice, law, and order. In neither case does this end well for those who second-guess God. Let us begin with the book of Ezekiel, where we also see some of the clearest depictions of what are now recognizable as phenomena of close encounter type, namely UFOs or UAP, as vehicles on the course of the Lord. Ezekiel is chosen by the Lord as a prophet of the tribulations that Israel will suffer on account of its defiance of the law and order that the Elohim revealed through Abraham and Moses. One of the main concerns of the book of Ezekiel is to give an account of the transgressions for which the Israelites are being punished. Especially relevant in this regard are Ezekiel 6, 8, 16 and 23. These passages charge the Israelites with setting up altars to gods other than the Lord of the Elohim, burning precious oils and scent-producing materials as incense in honor of these fetishes, shaping the gold granted by the Lord as war booty into phallic objects that feature on these altars, and that they used as dildos, decorating these altars with fine fabrics and images of various animals or gods in the shamanic shape of animals, like the golden calf during the Exodus in the desert, which was a symbol of Hathor. Building these shrines in various natural settings, mountaintops, large trees, springs, etc., carrying out ritual sexual acts or orgies, emulating the people surrounding them by engaging in such pagan practices and intermixing with these various aliens. In other words, abandoning the revealed law in favor of an eclectic cosmopolitan culture. Throughout Ezekiel 16, the Lord uses some very sexually charged language to compare Jerusalem to a whore on account of these syncretizing practices. Of particular interest in this chapter is the idea that the Lord found the people of Israel in a state of extraordinary vulnerability, like a naked and abandoned girl child. He claimed that this girl, whom he took it upon himself to be the guardian of until she became a beautiful and self-confident woman, repaid him by playing the whore and moreover a self-willed whore, undergoes, who does not serve men for money but freely takes whatever lover she wishes for her pleasure. Ezekiel 16:30-34. Since Ezekiel as a whole is especially concerned with the Babylonian exile community and the conquest of Israel by the Babylonians, Ezekiel 11-12, the language of this chapter can be seen to foreshadow that of the whore of Babylon, of course, that is, the goddess Ishtar, later on in the Bible. This is also the implication of the verses in Ezekiel 23 that compared the two great Israelite territories of Samaria and Jerusalem to two whores who lust after and breed with Assyrian and Chaldean governors and warriors from Greater Babylonia. This cosmopolitizing harlotry is compared to the early Egyptian influence on the Jews. The Lord repeatedly describes these allegedly perverse abominations as acts of rebellion and he goes so far as to call the Israelites a uniquely rebellious people. He demands that Ezekiel prophesy to Israel the vengeance that he is going to exact on it, and he reveals some of these acts and vengeance to the prophet in visions of the future. So the prophet Ezekiel is exemplary of prophecy in the sense of a warning of things to come. In Ezekiel 4:5 and 37, we see the Lord instructing Ezekiel in the use of sympathetic magic to help actualize these prophecies. These are essentially the same methods that, when used without the Lord's authorization, are condemned as sorcery or black magic. The episode of sorcery in Ezekiel 37 is especially noteworthy since it prefigures the resurrection of the dead in Christianity. The Lord carries Ezekiel to a valley filled with dry bones, and he is told to utter incantations over them that cause them to reassemble, be covered with flesh, and filled with the breath of life. The specific language of a future opening of the graves and a raising up of the dead is first used here. Two of Ezekiel's prophecies are of particular note insofar as they have been especially influential in Christian expectations of a future apocalypse. These are the prophecies concerning Gog of Magog and the third temple in Jerusalem. We are presented with these respectively in Ezekiel 38 and 39 and 40 to 45. These prophecies are supposed to concern the distant future Ezekiel 38 to 8. When the Israelites, after having been scattered all over the world, are reunited in the land of Israel, at the center of the world, where they live with great wealth amassed in towns without walls or gates. On this distant day, when the people of Israel are living in apparent security, Ezekiel 14 to 16, there will be an invasion of Israel by a leader named Gog from an empire called Magog to the east and north of Israel, which apparently includes Persia among other unidentifiable kingdoms. Ezekiel 5. This is the territory at the heart of the present-day Islamic world. This massive ground invasion of Israel will result in raising fires and earthquakes as part of a battle that litters Israelite territory with corpses and incinerates the cities of Magog. Following this, a third temple will be built in Jerusalem. Ezekiel is taken to the future and given a tour of this temple by a copperman who measures all of its proportions for him. It is in this context, from Ezekiel 40 to 45, that we meet with some of the best examples of the biblical idea of the sacred and the profane, a phrase explicitly introduced in Ezekiel 44:23. The plan of the temple and of the society that it is intended to sanctify exemplifies a notion of spaces and objects in them that are clearly demarcated as sacred and separated off, sometimes to numerous buffers from profane areas. We may even have the introduction of a sacred system of weights and measures for commerce. Ezekiel 45. Ezekiel reveals the template for the future kingdom of God on the earth, or rather, the robot from inside the UFO reveals it to us through him. Several things are particularly worthy of note with respect to the prophecies of Ezekiel. Firstly, in Ezekiel 17, the Lord asks Ezekiel to propound a riddle and relate an allegory to the house of Israel. This allegory, in which a vine or tree and two eagles feature as symbols, the significance of which the Lord himself interprets, is significant insofar as it allows us to see that the author of this text is very clear on the distinction between an allegory with symbolic significance, which is set apart as such, and non-allegorical narratives characteristic of most of the prophecies in the book. This example is also relevant to the biblical literature in general. The authors of this book of the Bible were in many cases aware of what is allegorical or symbolic imagery, and so we are distorting the text if we read narratives that are intended to be historical, including those setting forth a precognitive history of a future yet to come, as purely allegorical or symbolic rather than factual. Secondly, when Ezekiel prophesies, he appears to be very directly under the control of the Lord. Towards the end of Ezekiel 3, we are told that the Lord makes Ezekiel mute, except at times when he is to convey a specific message on behalf of the Elohim. The prophet is quite literally struck dumb and unable to speak in his own voice. This foreshadows the Muslim claim that Muhammad was chosen by the Lord in part because he was illiterate and untrained in the poetic arts, so he supposedly could not have composed the Quran on his own. Several passages throughout the book of Ezekiel also speak of the prophet being controlled in body and mind as if he were a puppet. Ezekiel 2, 1-2. He is fed a scroll featuring the lamentations, dirges, and woes, undergoes, that he is going to speak like an old computer being fed a punch card. Ezekiel 2, 9-10. Overall, the impression we are given of Ezekiel is that of a ventriloquist dummy. Thirdly, and most importantly, Ezekiel is ethically appalled by some of the things that the Lord reveals that he intends to do to the Israelites. We see this very clearly in Ezekiel 9, especially 9, 8-11, in a passage reminiscent of Abraham unsuccessfully negotiating with the Lord for sparing the inhabitants of Sodom, and the prophet Ezekiel asks the Lord in horror how or why he could treat people the way he intends to. The specific act of vengeance that catalyzes Ezekiel's protest is the Lord's command to 5 armed men, accompanied by a 6th who is a scribe dressed in the manner of a Levite priest, to go through the city and murder everyone, including old men, women, and little children, who do not object to the various practices of pagan idolatry that the Israelites are engaging in.
Then he called loudly in my hearing, saying, "Approach, you men in charge of the city, is bearing his weapons of destruction." And the 6 men entered by the way of the upper gate that faces north, each with his club in his hand, and among them was another, clothed in linen, with writing case at his waist. They came forward and stopped at the bronze altar. Now the presence of the God of Israel had moved from the cherub on which it had rested to the platform of the house. He called to the man clothed in linen, with the writing case at his waist, and the Lord said to him, "Pass through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who moan and groan because of all the abominations that are committed in it." To the others he said in my hearing, "Follow him through the city and strike. Show no pity or compassion. Kill off grey beard, youth and maiden, women and children, but do not touch any person who bears the mark. Begin here at my sanctuary." And so they began with the elders who were in front of the house. And he said to them, "Defile the house and fill the courts with the slain. Then go out killing." I remained alone. I flung myself on my face and cried out, "Ah, Lord God, are you going to annihilate all that is left of Israel, pouring out your fury upon Jerusalem?" He answered me, "The iniquity of the houses of Judah and Israel is very, very great, and the land is full of crime, and the city is full of corruption. For they say, the Lord has forsaken the land, and the Lord does not see. I, in turn, will show no pity or compassion. I will give them their deserts." And then the man clothed in linen, with the writing case at his waist, brought back word, saying, "I have done as you commanded me." Before Ezekiel registers this complaint, we have already been told that the Lord plans to annihilate his chosen people by letting those pestilence or disease upon them, subjecting them to a famine on account of which they will return to cannibalism, and setting numerous foreign armies against them to slay them by the sword and drive them into exile into disparate lands. The Lord seems very proud of the fact that he will do all this in wrathful passion and without showing the least bit of compassion for anyone. "Thus saith the Lord God, I set this Jerusalem in the midst of nations, with countries round about her. But she rebelled against my rules and my laws. On account of all your abominations, I will do among you what I have never done. Assuredly, parents shall eat their children in your midst, and children shall eat their parents. I will execute judgments against you, and I will scatter all your survivors in every direction. Assuredly, as I live, saith the Lord God, because you defiled my sanctuary with all your detestable things and all your abominations, I in turn will shear you away and show no pity. I in turn will show no compassion. 1/3 of you shall die of pestilence, and perish in your midst by famine. 1/3 shall fall by the sword around you, and I will scatter 1/3 in every direction, and will unsheath the sword after them. I will vent all my anger and satisfy my fury upon them. And when I vent all my fury upon them, they shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken in my passion. I will make you a ruin and a mockery among the nations round about you, in the sight of every passerby. And when I execute judgment upon you in anger and rage and furious chastisement, you shall be a mockery and derision, a warning and a horror to the nations round about you. I, the Lord, have spoken.
Ezekiel 5:5-15. One way that the Lord intends to spread disease seems to be by making the Israelites eat unclean bread that they have to bake on their own excrement, so that he is in effect telling them to eat shit and die, undergoes. Ezekiel 4:12-13. Another obviously would be children eating their parents and vice versa. Ezekiel has numerous distinct encounters with unidentified flying objects and the beings associated with them, and he describes these on at least 10 occasions in his book, often referring back to the first encounter at the Chebar Canal in Babylonia to assert that the phenomena witnessed are the very same as those experienced there. These 10 instances are Ezekiel 1, 4-28, 3, 12-15, 22-27, 8, 2-4, 9, 3, 10, 1-21, 11, 22-25, 37, 27, 40, 2-4, 43, 1-7, and 44, 1-4. By setting these complex and often confusing descriptions side by side, we can form a somewhat adequate phenomenological description of the objects and beings in question. It would be helpful to analyze the account of the sights, sounds, and sensations that Ezekiel experienced in terms of visual appearance of the objects and associated beings, their situation in terms of the surrounding environment, including their effect on their environs, and their capabilities to interact with persons. There seem to be 3 or 4 types of objects described, although a couple of these might be the same object or objects viewed from different vantage points or under varied conditions. The first is fiery whirlwind on the course with a glowing amber light within it. This is a flying object that makes a roaring and whooshing sound. It may also cause the earth to tremble. The whirlwind can abduct a person and carry him up and away against his will, depositing him elsewhere, for example on a mountaintop or a different city, in a state of shock and disorientation. The second object is a wheelwork on the course consisting of 4 freestanding wheels that can revolve in any direction, each of which is caught through by another such wheel. In other words, each of the 4 wheels described consists of 2 rings, one set within the other, each revolving in any direction, so that the 2 rings revolving together often appear as if they are cutting through each other. This sounds something like a gyroscope. The wheels are described as made of material similar to beryl, a crystalline material. They have markings that look like eyes inscribed all around them. These wheels are flying objects that can move in any one of the 4 cardinal directions at any point in their flight. This means that they can alter direction instantaneously without veering or swerving, like contemporary UFOs. Although there does not appear to be any material connection between the 4 wheels, they seem organizationally associated into a wheelwork on the course consisting of all of them, and it is possible for a man to step within this wheelwork. Each of these wheels is associated with a being of humanoid form, except that they have 4 faces, that of a human, a lion, a bull, and an eagle, each facing in one of the 4 directions, and they have 2 pairs of wings, one pair extending outward to touch the wingtips of the other cherubs on the course, and the 2 wings that cover their arms and hands when these are not extending towards someone or something. When their wings move, for example during ascent into the sky, the loud sounds like the din and clattering on the course of an army are heard. This sound is described as the voice of the Almighty when He speaks. These beings handle objects like hot coals inside the wheelwork, and flashes of lightning and fire flare up around them. Note that these winged beings, which are identified as cherubim, are the same beings that the Lord appoints to guard the garden of Elohim at Eden with similar rotating fiery swords or thunderbolts. At one point, one of them gives some of the glowing coal-like things to a man. Whenever these beings move, the wheels adjacent to them move as well, and vice versa. We are told that this is because the spirit of the beings is in the wheels. Another object closely associated with these wheels is a platform that appears somewhat like sapphire. Above the platform is a fiery being whose upper parts are human in shape, but whose lower extremities fade into fire. In the upper part of the being, the fire seems contained in a man-shaped glassy form, or perhaps the fiery appearing man is inside a glassy dome. There is a great deal of rainbow-colored light radiating around this being. One final type of object described seems to be the very same pillar of cloud from the Exodus. This is also a flying or hovering object that, at one point, comes to rest within the court of the temple at Jerusalem, and when it does so, it illuminates the entire sea, just as the pillar of cloud did when it became a pillar of fire by night guiding the Israelites through the Sinai desert by its light. The voice of the Lord is said to emanate from within this cloud. It is also associated with its own type of being, a man who looks like he is made of copper and who guides Ezekiel around the third temple, precisely taking all of his measurements and teaching him its blueprint. This metal man is clearly a robot or android, especially since his sole task is precise measurement. The phrase, "the presence of the Lord," on the course, is used with reference to one or more of these objects, and in one instance we have a description of the roaring sound and rumble as this presence of the Lord lifts up from where it is standing and takes to the sky. Ezekiel 3:12. In Ezekiel 37:27, the translators of the Jewish Publication Society's scholarly edition of the Bible have clarified that this word presence literally means dwelling place. That is, the Lord of the Elohim is inside the object referred to and seems to be using it to travel from place to place and interact with the prophet and others. It is clear from numerous passages that this presence within which the Lord is located moves from one distinct place to another.
But when the presence of the Lord moved from the cherubs to the platform of the house was filled with the cloud, and the court was filled with radiance of the presence of the Lord. The sound of the cherubs' wings could be heard as far as the outer court, like the voice of the Almighty when He speaks. Then the presence of the Lord left the platform of the house and stopped above the cherubs. And I saw the cherubs lift their wings and rise from the earth, with the wheels beside them as they departed. And they stopped at the entrance of the eastern gate of the house of the Lord, with the presence of the God of Israel above them. They were the same creatures that I had seen below the God of Israel at Chebar Canal. So now I knew they were cherubs.
Ezekiel 10:4-5, 18-20.
Then the cherubs, with the wheels beside them, lifted their wings, while the presence of the God of Israel rested above them. The presence of the Lord ascended from the midst of the city and stood on the hill east of the city.
Ezekiel 11:22-23.
Then He led me to a gate, the gate that faced east, and there, coming from the east with a roar like the roar of mighty waters, was the presence of the God of Israel, and the earth was lit up by His presence. The vision was like the vision I had seen by the Chebar Canal. Forthwith I fell on my face. The presence of the Lord entered the temple by the gate that faced eastward.
Ezekiel 43:1-4.
Then He led me back to the outer gate of the sanctuary that faced eastward. It was shut, and the Lord said to me, "This gate is to be kept shut and is not to be opened. No one shall enter by it, because the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered by it. Therefore it shall remain shut."
Ezekiel 44:1-2. The passages such as these explicitly state that the Lord of Israel is a finite being that occupies one or another definite space at any given time. Moreover, settling them in the context of the other passages cited above, we see that He does so by the means of a conveyance that gives off light when it flies and produces loud sound and vibrations when it is lifting off or landing.